What's happening, everybody? We are back. Acquire and operate. Another way of saying buy and build. We're buying and building a portfolio of enduring niche vertical SaaS businesses, all B2B, of course.
Flipping
Doing it in
companies.
public, and and it's a wild ass ride. Holy smokes. God, and we're out here and we're doing it. But anything worth doing is hard, and it's interesting what ends up being the hardest parts. So, anywho, the topic du jour is the minimum viable ACV, which is SaaS jargon for average contract value. Think what a typical customer is worth to the business in that first year for sales-led growth, which implies humans in the mix. So there's kind of two general flavors. You've got what is often framed as product-led growth, which is kind of BS. We think about it as like self-serve user purchases. So the user comes to your thing and buys it and onboards himself, etc. And then the other flavor is sales-led, which means a human runs a sales process. It's more consultative. It's usually bigger contract values. Maybe there's implementation humans involved, et cetera, et cetera. And so because of like those two things are kind of at odds, right? Where it's like we're going to have to pay more to acquire customers. So the simple question is, does the contract value make that viable? Viable A, which means you break even, which means investments in sales-led growth acquire customers at a break even. But none of us are here to break even. So the big question is, how profitable is it? So this is kind of back to splitting the atom, and it's an extension of sales velocity, honestly. So table of contents, we're going to talk through minimum viable ACV for sales-led growth, ROI and profitability expectations for AEs. And I think the most important thing, and I could have leaned into this more with the substance, but is like challenging everything that we're talking about in the generative AI era, because it is the great productivity multiplier. And so the question that should be on everybody's mind is, holy shit, is sales-led growth available to me? And it wasn't previously because of my contract value sizes. Do I have an opportunity to utilize sales-led growth in a context where before it wasn't feasible because we're living in a different era of business? And that's where it gets juicy. So it's kind of, I realize I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth, but it's like, hey, here's all the ways that people think about it. And then it's like, but you should try to break this.
Yeah.
So cool. So I guess where would we even start here? Yeah, so I think, go ahead. Or let's just start with why ACV matters, right? So, and this is like an extension of unit economics. And this is like a split the atom thing where it's like, who cares about all the other stuff? Can you acquire a business or a customer profitably? And there's some nuance in recurring revenue software subscription businesses where a lot of times it's like, well, I can actually pay twice what the customer's worth in the first year because they're going to stay with me for 5 years. And then that's when they pay you annually for 5 years. And that's lifetime value, customer lifetime value. So it's like we can incur losses in the near term because we're going to recoup those losses, and then we're into the profit, we're into the money with any given user on some type of timeline. The challenge is that requires cash to kind of fund, right? You've got to suffer near-term losses, and for many of us in the micro SaaS game, that's off the table. So you've got to be pretty rigorous that like, okay, like this needs to kind of break even on some timeline that we can support. So ACV is really the name of the game. Go ahead.
I was going to say it's kind of like talking about, going back to one of our later episodes, debt service coverage. It's kind of like you're going to take out this loan to try to make more money, generate more revenue at your business, but you want to make sure, hey, you're generating enough profit to cover this loan. But you're going to have to incur some costs in the meantime with origination fees, reinvesting that loan immediately back into the business and hoping that, hey, when you put in $1, it pulls out $1.25.
Exactly. And in our context, it's usually the debt to buy the business, right? But also if you're thinking about, we're going to take on this debt to create growth, it's like, all right, what does growth need to look like so you can pay your debt off? So it's all, and it all kind of, and that's kind of like a distinction between a break-even thought process and an ROI.
Mm-hmm.
One is like, we're not going to lose money. The other is we're going to gain. And what does that gain look like? What's that return on investment? So ACV matters because that's basically the starting point of like how valuable is a customer. And then from there, you can back into what you can afford to acquire that customer if we just keep it really simple. So key considerations, and there's different flavors here and there's different terminologies. You've got cost of sale is one. And I won't get into cost of goods sold, but usually that's related to kind of customer support. Like what does it cost? Like those costs are considered COGS if it goes towards supporting and delivering the product. So that's some elements of engineering, definitely customer support, but sales and marketing is considered its own thing. And then you get into CAC, which is customer acquisition cost. And there's some different flavors of CAC as well. Like you have, okay, we're going to pay a salesperson's salary. We're going to pay him commission and benefits. Okay. And then we're going to, like, what's the cost of marketing? And then you kind of get into this concept of like fully loaded CAC, or there's kind of varying degrees where it's like, all right, at the most basic level, are we breaking even after we pay our salesperson a commission and their salary? All right, are we breaking even after we pay marketing for generating the leads and creating the demand? Okay, put our ad spend in there. So you want to assume, I think probably your point of departure is fully loaded CAC, which is like all the sales and marketing costs, pull them together. That's your customer acquisition cost. To figure out what it is at the unit level, you divide all that spend by the number of customers you've acquired. And then average, and then that gives you kind of the unit level cost, and then you have the ACV to cover the unit level revenue. And now you can just divide them, or it's like one minus the other. Is it positive? Let's divide them. Is there a positive ROI? And so some common rules of thumb. And I guess the other piece, context-wise, is like, and gotta love Jocko over at Winning by Design. He's such a beast. But like, again, like the cost of growth in SaaS environments is very much under scrutiny right now. So a lot of firms are happy if they're paying if they pay twice the cost of the customer revenue to acquire the customer. And this is larger kind of public scale firms because, again, they can endure that loss in the near term. But there's a lot of discussion around it's increasingly difficult to the cost and the return on acquisition are moving against us. And that's a function of SaaS maturity in the world. That's a function of technology maturity across categories. There's a lot of macro stuff embedded in that. But the OG rule of thumb was a 3-to-1. So you want the lifetime value, and be so careful about lifetime value, because a lot of us, you need a lot of business like data to look at. It's like, what's your LTV? It's like, shit, I don't know. We've been around for 2 years. It's like, all right, you're still determining that, because it's like, if your LTV is, or you would, it's a 5-year timeline. Well, you have to be in business for 5 years to demonstrate that. So LTV is tricky. So, but usually we want a 3-to-1 CAC, which means a customer is going to generate $3 for every dollar that we spend to acquire them. What I've become more, or I would recommend being more of a fan of, is like a payback period. Because in our context where cash is tight, it's like, all right, if we acquire a customer, we get paid back in 3 months. So you probably want, 3 to 6 month kind of payback period that's more convention really across go-to-market motions, and sales-led growth that gets a little beefier. But I think you probably want to think in terms of CAC payback more so than LTV to CAC, because many of us don't have a lot of conviction around whatever LTV is. But that thing is usually 3-to-1. And a payback period is, you got to be clear, that's more straightforward. It's like, we're going to spend this to acquire this customer. After this much time, we're break even. Cool, because then you can form like, all right, this is kind of the cash flow that we need on hand to fuel those losses in the immediate term, so we don't run out of cash, because that's, cash is king. I'll pause there. CAC, so we kind of start with ACV, then we move into CAC, or cost of sale, some different flavors there. From here, we'll move into other considerations, which are sales cycle length and sales team compensation. But anything on CAC, cost, any, blah, 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 every other acronym under the sun.
Nope, nothing else there. I think the 3-to-1 ratio is a great way to wrap that up.
Beauty. So sales cycle length is is one that's kind of like a cheat code, where, and this is less so about like, and there's a distinction here between like introducing sales-led growth versus optimizing sales-led growth. So if you're like, oh, what's your sales cycle? The assumption is probably you've already got you've already got SLG in motion. But the simple rule of thumb is like, more than like a 3-month sales cycle, sales-led growth starts to not be viable, because it's very simple, right? The longer the sales process, the more a human is working something that generates revenue, the more cost that is being incurred to the business. So if you're like, yeah, our sales cycle is 6 months, it's like, all right, you got to be super thoughtful about AE headcount, because those costs are pretty beastly. And you want to make sure that you're achieving real kind of peak performance and productivity at the AE unit level before you scale up. So a sales cycle length.
I would say the rate that they consume tools. I mean, sales teams have the biggest tech landscape outside of the marketing tech landscape. So you also want to think about those costs as well. If your sales cycle is 6 months, there's a monthly subscription cost to everything that they're using and consuming.
And that's back to fully loaded CAC.
Yep.
Oh boy, you want to have that embedded tech spend is operating tech spend is a big line item. You want to factor that
Yeah.
in. All right, then into sales team compensation. So ACV as a weight, like just analogy, is surface area. The larger that surface area, the more interesting you can make compensation for your salespeople. So it's like, okay, if they're doing 100K deals, and you pay them 10%, okay, that's 10K. If they're doing 10K deals and you pay them 10%, that's 1K. And obviously you can recoup that with more volume of deals, and usually that's the exact trade-off. Bigger, fewer deals, smaller, more deals.
Yep.
And then, but just kind of back to context where the lower the ACV traditionally, the harder it is to create a really compelling incentive compensation structure, which means it's hard to attract talent. So that's just another gotcha to be woke to, where it's like, shit, man, we're going to have to pay our AEs 50% commission for them to make any damn money. And you can get
Yep.
clever with that. And there's other forms of compensation, of course, non-cash based, but that's another one just to be woke to.
Yeah, and that's gonna have to be a high volume environment, whereas high volume inbound or high volume outbound. And we know outbound is pretty much dead as it is today. So we're talking tons of advertising and content, SEO hacking, bring traffic to the site, and you just got to have them on the phones and emails all day. Oof.
There you go. There you go. So general guidelines based on ACV, and this is the shit we want you to challenge, is sub 10K, basically no shot sales-led growth is going to work. It's going to cost too much. 10 to
It is.
30K, you're in the mix. Sales-led growth works, probably maybe not be super profitable. You might have to have a longer point of view on the timeline to start to, I guess, see compelling ROI. North of 30K, go baby go. SLG all day. Cool. Let's move on. ROI and profitability expectations for AE. So this is one that, let's see. Okay. So one here. Okay. So for this one, again, this is kind of back to rules of thumb, which you want to challenge. And the context is obviously very dependent. Our context is very impactful, where, a lot of groups, well, let's just jump in. So we spoke about payback period. So if you just look at an AE, you want an AE for sure to break even in year one. Like that's table stakes. So it's like, hey, we're going to hire an AE. If they achieve this volume, we're going to pay them this salary. This is the commission. And that's kind of how you back into the commission rate. That's rational for the business. If they generate this much revenue, we're looking good. And so it's like, all right, round number, or I don't want to get too much in numbers. It's tough to listen to that stuff. But you want to see a break even in 12 months minimum, because that implies you made, or you didn't lose money in year one. And so it's not going to be a draw, and you have to be able to get through month over month, but it's not going to be a net draw on the business or a net drain on the business. When it comes to revenue targets and quota attainment, so I guess just to put a punchline on that, like year one break even is non-negotiable in Micro SaaS. It's probably like less than that. Like you want to break even on your AE, and then you get into some other elements, which we're going to talk about now. So revenue targets and quota attainment. So convention is like the AE should generate at least 2 times their fully loaded costs and revenue. So if you pay them 100K base and they're going to make 100K in commission, they need to generate 400K for the business. Pretty straightforward. But the gotcha here is the ramp period. So many models you see out there these days that don't have a ramp period, which means an AE's time to productivity, time to closing business and hitting quota, simply put. And so at a minimum, an AE ramp period is the sales cycle. They can't be productive faster than the buyers will buy shit. And that's another one where you would just see kind of like a structural disconnect, where it's like, how is the AE going to ramp unless they're stepping into an environment where they're inheriting an active pipeline, they're inheriting deals that are further along in the sales process, et cetera. But when you set quotas, just know that probably at least 8 weeks, the AE is not productive. So their annual quota needs to be adjusted, or you need to make up for that lack of productivity on the front end and the back end. a big decision point, but obviously that rolls right into the logic around 2x a return or 2x the revenue for the cost of AE on a fully loaded basis, which is mainly their salary and their commission.
Yeah.
Anything to add there?
Yeah, no, I was going to say it's rare that an AE inherits an active pipeline. Most times they won't know what to do with it unless it's like a super niche industry where it's all relationship based and they're just jumping from one company horizontally to another. It's rare that that's going to happen. So I think we all got to always adjust for the ramp time. That's super important.
And just make sure it's a feature in your model, 100%,
Exactly.
or an input rather. All right, so then we talk, and like CAC ratio is probably my favorite, which is basically like how efficient is every dollar of spend gives you what dollar in revenue, and that's kind of what we're going. That's the best. Burn ratio is like every dollar of spend across the entire business gets you what incremental dollar in revenue, but that's more like business efficiency and profit margin mechanics. The first is a function of just pure on sales efficiency. And so ideally, you don't want like a cost of sale, if we'll just keep our vernacular the same, to be more than 25 to 30%. Put another way, when an AE closes a deal, you want 70% of that revenue to go to the business because you're going to have to cover the other costs. You're going to have to do all that other stuff. So when that starts to get into 50, 60, 70%, you should start to feel a little bit squirrely.
And this is a good rule of thumb only because even today, given the economy and what's going on, discounting is at an all-time high. People are also AEs are starting to sell multi-year deals as another form of discounting without doing it outright. So a lot of companies, especially in Micro SaaS, we're starting to take on customers that they can't even afford to support. Deals being sold by AEs that they also can't afford to support financially either. So on both ends, the companies are struggling with customers they can't support and AEs they can't pay. And it's like, we've got ourselves in a tangled web here.
Yeah, totally. And that's, I guess, watch discounting. Obviously, you want to set up standards and kind of guardrails there, financial controls, because that stuff will put you sideways really. Or if you're on thin margins already, it's like, oh shit, every AE is discounting the ACV 15% to win deals. It's broken. They broke the thing, you know.
Yep, I would do some like heat mapping ratios across like, let's say, a grid where it's a matrix and it's just AEs on one side and then all the deals that they're closing, just to see like, hey, what are the ratio for each deal in terms of cost of sales. So yeah, if you find one AE is not being as efficient, let's go look into his pipeline. What are you doing, dude? And why are you discounting so heavily? And why are your customers not the type of ideal customer profile that we were looking for? Like,
and a lot of times that's an upstream issue, right? Where it's like you're not putting your pricing's off, the sales process is off. Like,
messaging
if it's like, oh, every salesperson is discounting 15%, it's like something really fundamental is off. All right, the wrap up. So, I mean, to make a sales-led growth strategy work, start with your ACV. And it's like, this is the surface area that we have to bring revenue into the business. Now, how do we do that and ensure that it's done profitably or at least at break even? You want your AEs to break even or better in 12 months, assuming that you can kind of endure some kind of losses month over month. You want an AE to ideally 2x their cost. So if they cost $200K, they bring in $400K of revenue to the business. You want their contribution to the business to be, at least 50, 60%. So when they win a deal, 50 or 60% of that goes down the P&L, so you can cover other costs, and ideally a good chunk of it makes it to the bottom line, and it's very profitable. The business is profitable. And then to conclude, like, this is a challenge, or we're going to try it. It's like, I think 10K, 15K, those thresholds used to be like, nah, sales-led growth doesn't work. And it's like, all right, but what if one salesperson punches like 1.5 or 2? Because we've injected all this automation and all this generative AI capability into their workflow. So they're, 50% more efficient, 100% more efficient. Then it's like, oh shit, we can actually pay this AE. We can hire one AE that's going to punch like 2. We can pay him up to the gills, and this works.
Economics.
And this works. So it's a fundamental shift in the unit economics because the inputs around labor efficiency change. So this is like very touches the physics of the thing. So so get out there and do some weird shit. Like, I think if you got a 5K ACV and you're doing SLG and it's ripping, God bless you, man. You're doing stuff that the vast majority of humanity would have told you is impossible, 2 years ago. So it's a cool time to be alive. I think it's probably the exclamation point. All right, Kjael, I think that's a wrap, my G. laser beams. I know your lasers are broken. I'm gonna throw up some laser beams.
Oh,
Laser
my lasers are coming.
beams. Oh, much love,
I'm gonna
buddy.
get them.
And no
All right,
doubt, I will
man. Enjoy
see you next week.
Hawaii. Please drop some pictures.
No doubt. Oh, I got pics on pics. But all right, brother. For the love of the game, we'll catch you later.
Love the game.